for this are Joseph Barnt and Barbara Major, who work with the People's Institute, I think is what it's called. But they've been doing trainings like this, and we will be having, it'll be a full of their two-day trainings on anti-racism, systemic anti-racism. And so you'll see the full information will be coming out next week with that. We'll look forward to registrations with that, and you can see me if you have any further questions or wanting more information about that. It will be $250. That'll include 6 meals and the Luther Glen staying at the retreat center, and then the workshop. So, yes, for 37 people, because of the speakers and stuff, is what we have. If we happen to go over that number of people, we'll break out into the cabins and we'll work with that.
Dates again?
April 27th through the 29th.
Are you able to remind us what the resolution that was passed at the
Okay, so the resolution we passed, was it last year or the year before, was that rostered leaders are strongly encouraged to have anti-racism training every 3 years. This will definitely meet that requirement. Also, we're hoping that this initial one will also help us in continued work throughout the Synod in developing really what we're wanting continued work throughout the Synod to be with regards to anti-racism.
Any other questions on this? Thank you much, Dr. Kärkkäinen.
As some of you may know, I wear 2 hats, that of a pastor and a professor. Do you know what's the difference between the two?
Salary?
Pastor, you give him a difficult, complicated topic. In a sermon of 20 minutes, he's able to make it totally understandable for everybody to understand. Professor, you give him the most simple and plain topic. In a 2-hour lecture, he's able to make it totally unintelligible and incomprehensible. I've been thinking with myself, perhaps I'm more pastoral today. My topic for today, or the subtopic is Evangelism, a theological conversation. I wish to provide some theological insights and reasons for doing evangelism, and on the other side, I wish to look at some possible reasons or excuses for us Lutherans avoiding evangelism. I know that you guys are not doing it, but in my own synod, they sometimes do. And because I'm a simple systematic theologian, my presentation falls in 2 parts. First, I will give you 5 excuses for not evangelizing, and then I give you 5 reasons for doing evangelism. But before getting ahead in our story, let me just simply define for you what evangelism might mean. You may give plenty of different definitions. You can probably find books on the topic. Mine is very simple: sharing the gospel. There are a number of ways of doing it, which reminds me of one seminary student who was doing his homiletics class, and you know, at the end of a preaching class, you need to deliver a sermon which will be then assessed and evaluated. This guy was very nervous. He went behind the pulpit and he began in the following way. Do you have any idea what I am going to preach today? And everybody said, of course no. And the guy said, no do I. And he stepped down. Both the professor and the class were totally confused, and they said, this will not go. This guy needs to pass and complete the assignment. We'll make a plan. Next time, when he asks the same question, we all say, yes, we do. So, next class. This poor fellow comes behind the pulpit. He's as nervous as ever, and he begins, do you guys have any idea what I may be preaching today? And everybody says, yes. They said, okay, then I don't have to preach. And now, like, everybody is like, totally like, they were totally mad. And the professor tells the guy, I'll give you one more chance. You fail it, and you fail the class. And when the student had left the classroom, the professor said, here's the plan. When he asks next time, half of the class says no, the other half says yes. Come next class. And the fellow is even more nervous than before. He asks, do you guys have any idea of what I'm going to preach today? And half of the class say yes, and the other one says no. And the response, then I don't have to preach. Those who know tell those who don't know. It's like what Francis of Assisi, the great medieval saint, a little bit modifying his saying, said, share the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. And I think this, you have heard this before, but it's a wonderful reminder to us that there are so many ways of being evangelistic, doing evangelism, speaking evangelism. So, with that in mind, let's look at 5 fairly common obstacles or excuses among us of why we think we are not supposed to be doing evangelism in a way like evangelicals and Baptists and Pentecostals do. One is prejudice. Every time you mention the term evangelism, some of us don't feel good about the term. We can list a big number of ways evangelism has been abused, misused. We can spend the whole rest of the day by telling awkward and awful examples of why evangelism doesn't sound good. I came across with a small essay, I don't know the person, probably Javen Swanson, Can Evangelism Be Redeemed? He's a seasoned Lutheran pastor. I just picked 2 or 4 main ideas. By the way, Terry reminded us, Gerald and I, to remind you that if you wish to have a copy of both of our PowerPoint slides, you may have it. So we are going to forward our own productions to Terry, and she will send to everybody who wants to have them. This pastor says, evangelism is a task I have most often avoided. I usually associate evangelism with an effort to convert non-believers to Christianity, something that makes me very uncomfortable, and to the extent that evangelism is about saving souls, I want nothing to do with it. I'm not quite sure, and I don't know the person, I am not quite sure what the term evangelism communicates to this pastor. I'm not quite sure if his understanding of evangelism is correct or accurate, but I can sense and identify with his feeling about the uneasiness because there's so much prejudice. Some of us say, no, we don't want to do evangelism, at least intentionally, because we don't want to be guilty of proselytism. That is, We don't, if anybody is going to convert from one church, say from the Baptist church to Catholicism, or from Pentecostal church to Methodist church, that is proselytism. And others say, no, any kind of conversion is proselytism. You may have a non or unchurched person, never baptized, never having a communion, but if you are too intentional about evangelism, you may end up being a proselytizer. Is this really what proselytism is? You may know originally the term proselytism meant conversion into Judaism of anyone. Nowadays, we need to be able to make a clear distinction between what proselytism is and what evangelism is. There are a number of ecumenical and other documents which also LWF, Lutheran World Federation, has signed, which are very clear about what proselytism is. Proselytism, briefly said, is an effort to evangelize by unjust, unethical, or unchristian means. For example, according to the law of love, or by a way in which you use bribery, you threat somebody, you take advantage of other person's lack of mental capacities, or you give an unfair description of either the other side or about your own church. But that is sheep stealing. If a Methodist wants to convert a Baptist by means of proselytism, that is sheep stealing. But it has nothing to do with a hospitable, fair, meaning just evangelism, even if it leads to the change of the church or becoming Christian for the first time. If a Lutheran gets convinced that he or she wants to become a member of the Pentecostal church, that is not by definition proselytism. It has to be looked at what were the means and the tools used to help that. So it's very important for us to be able to do the distinction. Some of us, particularly those of us who have lived or are living in multi-religious situations, we may say, we don't want to evangelize because there are so many religions and ideologies. How come can anyone, even Lutheranism, which of course is on top of the heap, how can it be true? The assumption is that if you have more than one option, certainly if you have many options, like secularism, atheism, Hinduism, Buddhism, you name it, by default, by definition, none can be true. And there are a couple of unwritten assumptions, perhaps particularly when it comes to our secular culture. One, no religion therefore has the right to seek to convince others. Now I'm not talking about proselytism, I'm talking about fair evangelism, because evangelism trumps, no pun intended, tolerance. You either are tolerant, meaning you are not, you do not have such convictions which may make you try to persuade others, or you are tolerant, everything goes and you have no confidence. Is that so? I don't think so. From the plurality of views, ideologies, religions, of course, does not necessarily follow the absence of truth. Confusion may follow, difficulty of deciding may follow, but there's no reason why having more than one option would necessarily, theologically or logically, that would mean none can be true. And what is tolerance? Tolerance means a capacity to disagree in a civil manner among people of various persuasion, but it does not lack, tolerance does not mean a lack of conviction. Those of you who know languages can easily parse tolerance, Latin tollere, to bear a burden. You need the capacity to bear the burden of disagreement, uncertainty, exactly when your society allows you to have different kinds of opinions. A truly pluralist, democratic society facilitates the emergence and existence of various kinds of opinions, so that those who do not want to believe any ideology or any religion have their total freedom. Those who want to be Muslims can be Muslims. And everybody who is not guilty of proselytism has the full right and perhaps even a responsibility to propose one's own truth statement. And confidence in truth of the gospel does not have to mean arrogance, but rather a hospitable sharing. Evangelism is sharing the gospel, which takes me to the fourth prejudice, or excuse, and that is pride. Often we Lutherans say something like, to evangelize is to pretend that we are better or that we know more. We want to be humble. Who among us really knows enough of the gospel? Perhaps somebody else, even totally non-churched, may have a better moral quality of life, and certainly might have. And my response is, for sure, any evangelism done out of those motives is to be rejected. If somebody's evangelism comes out of sense of pride, superiority, arrogance, it has very little to do with the gospel of Christ and the law of love, even if that may have the right and correct words. But again, this has little to do with the desire to share the gospel of salvation by a sinner, me, with other sinners, all of us, both of us, in need of the mercy of God. Authentic evangelism comes from below, humility, rather than from above. And you may know this gentleman here, that's not Gerald, that's C.S. Lewis. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Brilliant as he was. Ed Stetzer, whose name some of you may know, had an essay, and I have added the links for those of you who want to get. He's talking about churches. They are hospitals, not country clubs. Sorry, Gerald, you live in a country club. Churches without the broken people are broken churches. You get the point. You can find, or a sinner can find herself in a church which says the right things, but couldn't be more exclusive or having sense of superiority. That's not us. I'm not calling for that kind of evangelization. And our own man said, the church is the inn and the infirmary for those who are sick and in need of being made well. Heaven is the palace of the healthy and the righteous. That's the earlier Romans lectures. Finally, last but not least, and I had because I need to find 5 P's. I couldn't find. I'm a preacher after all, so that's the way we preachers do. Usually we have 3 points and then a poem, but now I have 5 points and no poem. I call it providence, and I need to explain what it means. Believe me, it means something which is in keeping with the rest. That it is not our business, but rather God's business to bring people to the knowledge of the gospel. if God wants to save someone, God has the ways of doing. We need to rely on God's omniscience, omnipotence, and you know all those words. And whether that happens or not, it is still God's business, responsibility. Is that so? Yes and no. And now I give you some Catholic stuff. It is absolutely true, but it's a half-truth. It is absolutely true, and according to Lutheran doctrine, to believe that God can mysteriously find God's way to people's hearts. Gaudium et Spes, one of the 16 Vatican documents, says the Church in the modern world. In the hearts of all men and women of good will, grace works in an unseen way. For since Christ died for all men and women, and since the ultimate vocation of man and woman is in fact one and divine, we ought to believe that the Holy Spirit, in a manner known only to God, offers to every man and woman the possibility of being associated with the puzzle mystery. We can only say amen and amen and amen. Yes, there's no limits to God's providing grace. You may have the prodigal son, you may have the thief on the cross, you may have the most convinced atheist in whose hearts God may still find something, and so that's true. But that's only half truth. And here again I refer to our man, Martin Luther. He was commenting on Isaiah 65:1, and I have the verse for you. I know that you know it by heart, but he was using an older translation. I, God, was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. Luther asks himself a rhetorical question: are we not to seek him, but only to wait for him till he is found by chance? And he also continues in the same like, does it mean that it's not given to us as Christians to even try to be too actively telling others? So he asks these legitimate questions. He answers himself no. He says, this verse is against whom he calls stupid. Self-righteous people, searchers, not the authentic ones. The former ones, those who are not seeking God, do not really wish to find him, whereas the sincere people who are seeking, they can find God, and it is totally legitimate and good for us as Christians to push them forward. Implication being, whereas God certainly has mysterious ways to save people, it is not left to us to speculate, but rather to do our responsibility. It's absolutely possible God may save our neighbors, but our task is not to have a council with God and say, could you take care of that? I'm so busy, I talk to people at my workplace. He may or may not collaborate with you. Okay, and now, so what we have done so far is I have provided you 5 excuses for not evangelizing: prejudice, proselytism, pluralism, pride, and providence. Let's take some time, pick one of those in your table, at your table, whatever, close to your table, and pick one of those 5, talk about that, and let's see what happens. And then we go into the more positive stuff.
That's what always
struck me as very strange. Or I had even talked to well, it was actually and boy, can they be the way I understand it, and again, my job is not to save people. That's God's job. My job is to give these people better interest, the opportunity to find Jesus and to establish a relationship. Which I'm not spoken enough about help, but my problem is, we had this week, one of my parishioners had to go to the doctor